Imagine you were a German pilot tucked safely behind a wall of thick gray clouds. Below you, the Allied army is blind. In this era of war, if you can't see the enemy, you can't hit them. You feel invincible. You feel like a ghost. But suddenly, a shell tears through the fog and detonates directly on your left wing. Then another and another. You aren't being hunted by a man. You're being hunted by a microwave beam. To understand why this was a miracle, we have to understand how bad the Allies were at shooting things down. Before 1944, anti-aircraft warfare was a guessing game. Gunners used optical sights, literally telescopes, to track planes. If there was smoke, rain, or night, the guns were useless. On average, it took 2,500 heavy shells to bring down a single German bomber. It was like trying to hit a bird with a handful of sand from a mile away. The Luftwaffe knew this. They owned the night. They owned the clouds. But in a secret laboratory at MIT, a group of civilian scientists were about to turn the sky into a trap. Enter the radiation lab. This wasn't military headquarters. It was a cluster of classrooms filled with vacuum tubes and chalkboards. Their project was the SCR 584. SCR stood for Signal Poor Radio, but this was more than a radio. It was the world's first automatic tracking radar. Older radars could find a plane, but they couldn't stay on it. The 584 used something called conical scanning. It spun a beam of energy like a flashlight in a dark room. If the echo from the plane was stronger on the left, the machine automatically pivoted left. It was a machine with a predatory instinct. It locked on, and it never let go. But the real breakthrough wasn't just seeing the plane. It was what happened next. The radar was connected to a massive 3,000-pound box called the M9 gun director. This was a mechanical computer, a maze of gears, cams, and wires. The radar fed the M9 the plane's position. The M9 calculated the lead, the wind, and the gravity. Then, through thick electrical cables, the computer took control of the heavy 90mm guns. The soldiers didn't even have to look through the sights. They watched in awe as the massive barrels moved by themselves. They pivoted in perfect unison, like they were possessed by a spirit. The system's first real test came at the Anzio beachhead in Italy. Allied batteries were scoring direct hits on planes they couldn't even see with their own eyes. 5 planes down, 10 planes down. The Luftwaffe began to panic. They reported back to Berlin that the Americans had developed a weapon that defied the laws of physics. The invisible eye was open, and for the German Luftwaffe, there was nowhere left to hide.
By June 1944, the Allies had landed in Normandy, but Hitler had one final card to play. It was the V-1 flying bomb, the world's first cruise missile. The British called it the buzz bomb because of the terrifying stutter of its pulse jet engine. It was a pilotless drone packed with a ton of high explosives screaming toward London at 400 miles per hour. Because it was small and fast, it was a nightmare for traditional gunners to track. London was being hammered by over 100 missiles a day, and the city was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The British air defense was failing miserably, hitting only 1 out of every 2,500 missiles launched. Desperate for a solution, the Allies launched Operation Diver. They moved every SCR 584 radar unit they had to the southern coast of England, but the radar was only half of the secret. The other half was a tiny device hidden inside the artillery shells called the proximity fuse. Previously, a shell had to physically hit the target or be timed perfectly to explode near it, but the proximity fuse was a miniature radio station that could sense the metal of the V-1 as it flew past. The SCR-584 would lock its microwave beam onto the incoming missile. The M9 computer would calculate the intercept point and swing the heavy guns into position. When the guns fired, the shells didn't need a direct hit, they just had to get close. The results were a slaughter. In a single day, the radar-controlled guns swatted 82 out of 104 missiles out of the sky. By the end of the month, the success rate jumped to nearly 90%. The Luftwaffe engineers back in Germany were stunned. They watched their miracle weapons disappear into puffs of black smoke before they even reached the coastline. They began to suspect the Allies had developed sentient guns that could think for themselves. In reality, it was just a microwave beam and a circuit board working in perfect harmony. The SCR-584 had turned the most advanced weapon of the Nazi arsenal into target practice. London was saved, not by brave pilots in the cockpit, but by scientists in a lab. The era of human-aimed warfare was dead, and the machine had taken over the sky.
As the winter of 1944 fell over Europe, the German High Command made one last desperate gamble. They launched the Ardennes Offensive, known today as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler waited for a massive weather front to move in, grounded the superior Allied Air Force in thick fog. The Luftwaffe believed this was their moment to reclaim the skies and destroy the Allied supply lines. But they didn't realize that the SCR-584 didn't need clear skies or a sunlit horizon. While the Allied pilots were stuck on the runways, the radar units were being towed into the frozen forests. These were now mobile units, ruggedized and ready for the front lines. German aces flying the latest Focke-Wulf fighters dove through the mist, expecting total silence from the ground. Instead, they were met with the most accurate anti-aircraft fire in the history of human warfare. The SCR-584 was now so precise it could track a target within 0.06 degrees. German pilots were being picked off through solid white fog, as if the Americans had X-ray vision. Even more devastating, the Allies began using the SCR-584 to guide their own bombers. The radar would track the Allied planes, and a ground controller would tell the pilots exactly when to drop their bombs through the clouds. The Germans were trapped in a war where the weather was no longer their ally, but their executioner. By the time the sun came out, the Luftwaffe had been bled dry. They had lost hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and aircraft to a ground weapon they never even saw. The most incredible part of this story is that the Germans never captured a working SCR-584. They never truly understood why their planes were falling out of the sky with such surgical regularity. History remembers the atomic bomb and the Jeep as the winners of World War II, but the SCR-584 was the silent architect of Allied victory. It proved that the future of war wasn't about who had the bravest pilots or the fastest engines. It was about who had the best data and the fastest circuits. When the guns finally went silent, the SCR-584 had effectively erased the Luftwaffe from the sky. The machine had spoken, and the masters of the air were no more.